Welcome everyone to our webinar today for Performance Benchmarking Meets R&D. I will get started, and thanks so much everyone for joining us. I'm super excited to introduce our guest speaker, which I'll be doing in just a minute. This is as some of you who've worked with OPEXEngine over the years, you know that this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart as someone who's worked in tech companies from the business side I was starting to calculate it today, but we'll just say a little bit over 30 years. And I think bringing together the business objectives and the business understanding together with the R&D management is a particular goal of mine. I think that's what tech companies are all about, and we want to bring benchmarking as a platform to provide a better context for that conversation. So I'm excited to kick off that conversation today. Excuse me, and I'm also fighting a cough, so I apologize if I catch on my words here. So we're going to be talking about defining R&D ROI and some key KPIs for the R&D department. We're also going to be talking about aligning priorities between the finance and the business objectives together with R&D and current trends. And at the end, we're going to be introducing OPEXEngine's new R&D benchmarking. So with that, I'd like to ask our special guest today, Rob Levy, really to give us a little bit of his background about you have this amazing background both with large companies and small companies. And as Rob and I got to know each other before this webinar and working together at Bain, it was funny the number of places where our lives have overlapped a little bit between Progress here in the Boston area, CA, my arch enemy and competitor at one point with BEA. So I'd love to get your background and introduce you. I'm just so pleased to have you on the webinar. So Rob, please introduce yourself and give us a sense of why you have a perspective on bringing together business objectives and R&D management.
Thanks, Lauren. And I just wanted to say there's never enemies in the software business because we end up working with each other in the other company that we used to be enemies of.
Exactly.
So first, hello, everybody. My name is Robert Levy, Rob Levy to my friends. I'm an expert partner out of our Chicago office, which is relatively new because I spent most of my life in Silicon Valley. And expert partner really means I came out of the industry versus out of the consulting organization, which is why I think I really appreciate Lauren calling me in to participate in this webinar. I spent most of my life going through the software development organization, anywhere from the beginning of my life as a developer, all the way kind of going through head of development, CPO, CTO, head of strategy, M&A. Spent 3 decades going across from very small companies, 50 to 100 million, all the way to companies like Computer Associates at whatever it was, 4.5, 5 billion, and anything in between. Was responsible for some of the interesting parts of the industry, especially the introduction of SOA, service-oriented architecture, which ended up being what we now call containers and distributed computing. And I think the thing that makes it really interesting for me to participate in this is because as I was growing up through the organization, especially in the old days of waterfall and very rigid development processes, we really didn't measure many things in engineering. We kind of knew what we were doing. The CPO and the management team were supposed to kind of be more project and process managers of the organization in terms of how we do. We had some spreadsheets. We had maybe Microsoft Project, if any one of you remember that. And but we didn't really create any true KPIs other than spending most of the time. And as I kind of grew to the organization, especially in the last decade, maybe decade and a half, when Agile became popular, a lot of the things that we were doing in both in the product side and in the engineering side became more and more measurable. There were more and more tools to measure, and the importance of understanding those measurement KPIs became critical to our ability to truly implement agility, which I'm separating for a second from agile, but agility in terms of being able to see, process, measure, respond, and keep refining. I apologize, the noise you're hearing behind me is we're in Chicago. We have Aviation Week, and the F-16s that are doing the sonic booms are flying. We live by the lake, so they fly right above our head and do the sonic boom. So if you hear a large boom, nothing bad happened, just F-16 pilots doing their thing. Anyhow, going back to measurement, in the last 5 or 6 years, when I joined Bain as a expert advisor, specifically on R&D and process, on management and innovation. It became, just like Lauren, it became really a project of mine trying to formalize some of the experience we have at our customers with what we are seeing, what they're seeing, finding the commonalities, and eventually we ended up with what Lauren's going to talk about, which is the benchmarking, where we're physically logging down all of those KPIs down to a pretty deep level, and be able to turn them around, report on them, and then integrate them as part of the development and engineering process. And with that, I'll give it back to Lauren.
That's awesome, Rob. Thanks so much. So I wanted to kick this off just to set the stage a little bit and talk about, just show some benchmarks from public companies. And as most of you know who know OPEXEngine, we track benchmarks for private and public companies, but this is sort of a nice way to set the stage. We took a look at the Bessemer NASDAQ Cloud Index companies, and we segmented them by these 3 categories: 100 to $500 million public companies, 500 to $1 billion, and billion plus companies. And when you look at it that way, just straight looking at R&D expense, average for each of these groups, you can definitely see, and this is sort of traditional high level thinking, oh, as you get bigger, R&D expenses go down. But then we took a different slice of it. And as people know, OPEXEngine, our whole belief is that the devil's in the details, and you have to look at what relates most closely to you and segment your benchmarks in ways that relate to your business. So we sorted this by looking at expenses for companies that are currently in the current market, highly valued versus less well valued. And we segmented that into the top quartile of high valuations and bottom quartile of valuations. And you can definitely see, particularly at the sort of top and the bottom of the spectrum of public companies, so 100 to 500 million, that the companies in the top quartile are spending a lot more. And in the mid-range, it's actually relatively close, and it's a smaller group of companies. The N for the top and the bottom, I think one was 27 and the other is something over 20, whereas the segment in the middle. So I wouldn't pay as much attention to that, but it's also, one of the things that I think we don't take into account is thinking about product-led growth. And I, as many of you have heard before, think that we should think about that when we calculate the cost of customer acquisition, because traditionally that's only considered in terms of sales and marketing expense. I think if you have a product-led growth company and you're using that to acquire companies, you should think about R&D. But I think it sort of is interesting to look at it this way to see how it turns some of the thinking about R&D expense just naturally coming down as you grow the company. It depends on what you're doing and how you're using R&D. And so another way that we look at, and for the companies, a lot of the participants on this webinar are customers of ours, that we like to do a standard benchmark, which we call R&D ROI, which is just looking at, for every dollar that you spent last year in R&D, how many dollars of new revenue are you gaining or growing this year? So for every dollar last year, how many dollars do you get this year? And, of course, sales and marketing, markets, products all have an impact on that, and things like COVID or whatever. But in general, it's kind of a nice, very standard way of looking at things. And you can see that as companies get bigger, they typically, on average, get more return on their R&D investment. So there are absolutely economies of scale as you get bigger. And then in addition, we took a look at it against market cap multiples. And again, there's definitely a correlation between the better your R&D ROI is and your market cap multiple. So I think it's, from a business perspective, it is definitely a blunt instrument. It is not perfect, but it's a good thing to stay on track, keep on top of. So, and for those who are interested, as we said in the housekeeping, we'll be sending out the slides afterwards, but this is all the detailed information. So in the previous slide, we excluded some outliers like Zoom, because their numbers are kind of crazy. They're getting over $8 per dollar of R&D, and companies like that. I think the other big one was Block, which is, earning money through transactions and other things. So with that, I wanted to kick off the conversation with Rob, because we had some really interesting conversations just preparing for this webinar, talking about, let's just get it out straight. What's the difference between R&D ROI, which we've just defined at a business level, and R&D productivity, because people use those interchangeably sometimes. What do you think, Rob?
Well, so originally we looked at R&D productivity in terms of our R&D. And when I say R&D, I really mean product and engineering. Our R&D ability to generate whatever they were supposed to be generating in terms of product and delivery. And in the old days, especially in the waterfall days, when cycles of development could be, spend more than a full year, we really had a tendency to measure the R&D ROI, quote unquote, in terms of cost. So we kind of looked at how much R&D cost us and then how much the company is doing in general. And we compared those two to each other and pretended that we had a good view of ROI. R&D productivity was truly just measured at the time by the physical creation. So things like lines of codes, okay, lines of codes, and how long does it take to create a product or a piece of a product, or how long does it take to resolve a maintenance issue. Somewhere in the mid-90s, when Agile became a lot more prevalent in the development organizations, we started to think about things in a much shorter term. So what it allowed us to do is create a much better correlation between what R&D was doing and how is R&D affecting the top line revenue for the company. And ROI became more about measuring what is the portion of the growth that can be directly related to R&D creation, productivity, and how can we improve one to improve the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And, it's interesting because 20 years ago in sales and marketing was usually, in the old days in traditional software companies, it was very much measured by what percentage of revenue are you spending in sales and marketing? And again, this sort of old concept of, well, as revenue gets bigger, you should spend less in sales and marketing. And then productivity was measured by activity. How many calls did you make? How many customers did you talk to? Not in terms of outcomes like, your magic number or CAC payback periods or things like that measure more the outcome and the efficiency around what you're doing as compared to just straight activity. How many trade shows did you go to? Those kind of things. And it's interesting to think about applying that on the R&D side. And I think in an agile world, you have to. So how do you
Not only
measure?
you have to, one of the nice things about agile is that it reduced the cycle of development. If you're going to think 15 years ago, the development cycle included 50 features and 300 maintenance problems all rolled into one large version that took a year. So it's very difficult to measure each one of those individual contribution to each one of those function features contribution to the true ROI versus just generically. One of the things that happened with Agile is we reduced those cycles down sometime to a week or 2 weeks, so we can measure specifically where things come out, both from a increase of sales and an increase of potentially problems coming back. But more importantly, we really understood in the last maybe 6 or 7 years, we really put a lot of emphasis into instrumentation. Think A/B testing, when we can now physically tell if we're testing a function, do people like it on version A of this product or version B of the product? We do this thing to see the customer voice, voice of the customer. But in reality, if you measure those, you can also measure the direct impact of those on quote unquote closing the deals and creating a sale at the end of one specific function feature, which is a very small, much more direct view of where the impact is. And that's the point when you can now say, when before we said ROI, as you said, we really thought kind of globally at an annual big product level. We're now dropping it down and down and down and down more and more. And we're going to talk about that later when we talk about Agile and KPIs, down to potentially one single function feature in a month or 2 worth of development.
Yeah, and you reminded me that in the old days, it was really just about new product sales. You invest in something and then you track the new product sales. Whereas here, because we're talking about a subscription business for most cloud businesses, it's not just new product sales, but it's also, you can measure, as you said, with the instrumentation, you can see a customer engagement with some new feature, which then directly is associated with renewals and upsells. And so R&D is measured not just in terms of new customer acquisition, but in terms of retention and upselling in addition. Yes,
both. And it's the most important part, I think, that I would like to highlight about what you said is that now, because we're paying on a subscription base, it is the response of quote unquote, I don't like it anymore, is much more immediate and immediately noticeable. Where before, when I was working at Computer Associates, everything used to run on an ELA, Enterprise License Agreement, which really meant from an engineering perspective, and I'm being blunt here, I don't really care what you think because you locked yourself in for the next 3 to 5 years. So 3 years from now, 2.5 years from now, when we get close to re-signing the ELA, we'll give you a little more of attention from the sales guys, from the engineering teams, maybe talk to you about function features that are important to you. And once we get that signed, we kind of go back to that normal, where almost everything was quote unquote maintenance mode. Agile moved us to, there is no maintenance mode. Everything is happening continuously on the time, both function features and maintenance. The response feedback loop is immediate. If people don't like it, they just stop paying and move away. But they also respond in terms of giving you feedback, which makes the voice of the customer probably the most important thing that is happening in terms of measuring, are you doing well? Not just a financial, am I doing well as in terms of selling, but really preceding that, how are my customers doing? How do they care? Are they engaged? Are they using the product? And if not, what are they not using? Where are the complaints coming from in terms of missing functions or new functions that they would like to see? And if you kind of keep track of all of that on real time, which is where the important message is, if you keep track of that on real time and make sure that the process across the board, from sales to marketing to product to engineering, all work in tune with the voice of the customer, that is where ROI really grows significantly. And you can see that in software companies, where the older software companies are less responsive to the market. They have a tendency to have a small, maybe single-digit growth. And the newer companies, not necessarily newer from age, but newer in terms of approach, have double digits, 20, 30, something, 40% growth in terms of their responsiveness to the market.
That's so great, because I think that's a message that you don't hear as much, but what I'm hearing you say is that in order to measure R&D productivity, you absolutely have to include measures of the voice of the customer, NPS, retention rates, whatever you measure in your company, that you have to link that to your R&D productivity as an overall business metric.
Yes, and that is not the realm of only new, exciting companies. This is the realm of every company, from my old dinosaurs all the way till today, the newer companies. If you can understand how to make your product agile, if you can understand how to connect the dots, if you listen to your customer and you measure and implement that measurement into your process on a regular basis, the result shows itself.
Absolutely. So for all the finance and product executives out there listening to this, we need to make sure that they have models that measure that and tie it together. So let's talk about just overall, we had a lot of questions from the audience as they were registering. What do people see as, or what do you see, Rob? And we had some discussions with a few other partners at Bain about this, about the, what are the key R&D KPIs that you think any company ought to be tracking?
So there's three major ones: financial, quality, and speed. And it's kind of interesting because we used to say speed, quality, financial. So the order now is different. And part of the reason is because R&D now can be measured. And if you kind of look at the financial KPIs that we're talking about, and there's many of them, and when we go to look at the spreadsheets and at the reports, you can see there's dozens upon dozens of ones. But in general, if you kind of look at the financial first, there's really, you can see that there's multi-tier approach. R&D ROI, which is at the top. This is, we said, you measure the total incremental sales over the total incremental spend of R&D for the specific item that you're measuring. Not just the total amount, but specifically to something you're doing, either a project or a product or a function feature. And then you kind of go down from that, right? How much is R&D spending from a total percent of revenue? And this is a little more complicated because it depends on the state of the company. If the company is mostly stable in sort of maintenance growth mode, the R&D spend have a tendency to be lower. If the company, for example, decided to invest in a brand new area, when I was at BEA, we were at a $1 billion stable maintenance company at a 7% growth, but at the same time, we decided that we need to grow. So we invested several hundred millions in a new R&D organization. So the R&D spend across the company grew, but not by much, because the add-on piece was maybe 15% of the total spend. But for that 15%, R&D versus revenue, obviously in the beginning was 100% spend, zero revenue. And at the end of 3 years of that exercise, that 10% extra spend on R&D created about 35 to 40% increase in sales. So the R&D spend as part of revenue needs to be taken in relationship or in context of what is the state that you're in, and are you closer to the maintenance mode, which is relatively stable? Are you investing in something new, or are you just milking the product, which is what I did at Progress with some of the product line that were around for 30 years, and you invest the minimum amount of money and personnel you need to spend in order to just not lose customers or not do churn. Then expense to revenue per product, I think, is really important because it's only been around with us for maybe the last decade, maybe even less, where we now can really slice the information down. We could always slice it down from a, lines of code and R&D people working. But as you start thinking, for example, agile, when agile groups work, they will pick up technical debt and function features for multiple queues. It becomes a lot more complicated to keep track. Before, we used to have business unit 1, business unit 2, R&D department A, R&D department B. Now we have cells, and those cells kind of pick information and pick up work for multiple queues. It becomes even more important to make sure that you keep track from a methodology perspective and from a product and tool perspective, keep track of who's working on what and when. Things like Jira, things like that live on top of Jira, like reporting, things like PlanView, that make sure you understand who's working where, because otherwise it becomes really difficult to correlate who's doing what in each product and what is a product now. Is it a piece? Is the whole thing? Is the full release? Is the partial release? And then now that you go from that, you go down to cost per developer hour. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in. What's interesting to me is that some of these metrics, it's like anything that we recommend in the benchmarking or in modeling, it's sort of tops down, bottoms up, tops down, bottoms up. So you have at the highest level what your R&D ROI is in terms of your overall expense and investment in R&D against growth in revenue. And
both from actuality as well as the actual plan. Because there is a, yes. Right?
And
there's
then,
an ROI in the plan and there's ROI actual.
And then in the same way that we would do in sales and marketing or in looking at cost of customer acquisition, you want to look at cost of customer acquisition across the whole company, but then you want to segment it by certain customers because some customers are profitable and others, every company, particularly as you increase the number of, customers you sell to, different markets, et cetera. It's very similar to you always have some profitable products or some high growth products, and then you oftentimes have other products that didn't quite meet the expectations of growth and sales. So you're breaking it down into the different groups so that you can identify where you want to allocate your resources around the highest growth and the highest profitability. And then same thing, I guess, really breaking it down, cost per development hour.
Which is a relatively low unit of measurement. But one of the things that I think it's important to realize, R&D for many, many years used to live in the dark. It was one of those voodoo dark arts where nobody in the organization understood what you were doing except for the people in the organization. And we gave them the total budget for the year, and then we told them to leave us alone and let us do our thing. What is happening now?
Exactly.
Both the process allows more light to be shed on what engineering R&D is doing, but more importantly, the business people from the CFO all the way down into the business units and business use organizations have a much better understanding about the technology, about the use of technology, especially about the voice of the customer, and their expectation of having a much more direct and much more data-driven conversations happen in a much smaller cycle. And we're going to talk about that later in terms of reducing that cycle down from the annual all the way down to wherever it can be. But let me just jump to the next one. So financial is financial, right? Which is the most important one, obviously. Then there's two. We probably should have put them next to each other, right? Quality and speed. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about tech debt later. But quality has really always been how far from perfect do I need to be in order to release? And software quality, both in the building process as well as at the post-release, we have to be able to measure how is the quality of the product when it's released, how many bugs are there, how many responses are there, tech debt, which we're going to talk about that in a second, and then NPS, which is not really software quality per se, it's more like the customer response to what we're doing. And again, I'm going to talk about the fact that NPS and software quality are not always directly related to each other. Sometimes they're related to speed, which is how fast can we release something and how fast should we release something? And you make those decisions, that balance between how small is the piece I need to release and what's the most important prioritization for that release. Can I make it up on time, good enough to send it? So NPS would be great, but software quality would not be affected, meaning the customer would like it and that the software quality would not be affected.
Well, yeah, so NPS is sort of like R&D ROI. You could argue that there's many other factors that can affect your sales and marketing people could be terrible, but you have absolutely the best products in the world, which is what I've often heard from developers that, why?
Is there a developer that does not believe that the product is the best in the world? We know better than everybody.
Exactly. Whereas software quality is a little harder to measure, but you gave some good examples of that. So let's talk about tech debt. And I'll give my simplistic business perspective on tech debt because I actually lived through this morning. We were putting together a really quick spreadsheet for the Bain's much more extensive and complex budgeting process than what we're used to. And under pressure to get it done in about 20 minutes, I was on a call with my CFO and I was building out a model and I was just hard coding the numbers and putting things in. I wasn't putting formulas in, which was driving her crazy. And she's like, you got to put a formula in there. And I said, I don't have time. If we like this model, we'll stick with it and we'll update the formulas. It's easy enough to do. So that's my analogy to tech debt, is you make conscious decisions that at a certain time you want to get something out. So you cut corners on the quality, as you mentioned, Rob, but consciously, because you know it's not, a problem. But then if you keep using it, if you keep using that workbook, then you go back and you link the sheets so that they can be updated quickly. You put the formulas in so it can be updated. But it's not, in my Excel example, it's not because a new version of Excel or a new version of Chrome that I need to upgrade to comes out 6 months later. That's not tech debt, that's maintenance. Tech debt is stuff that you consciously and intentionally go back and choose. So how do you measure that from a company perspective or from an R&D management perspective?
So first, I completely agree with what you said, but let me just kind of maybe round it up a little bit. The term itself started about the mid-1990s when agile programming became a reality, and it really was designed to measure what is left to do. So things that we knew we should have done or we didn't know that we should have done, and I'm going to touch on that in a second, that creeped up, that we now have to do on top of what we already know that we have to do. Kind of what the things that are left behind from before that are still with us that needs to be resolved.
So that kind of implies it's what you originally spec'd, but you decided to go to production.
So yes, so let me spend a minute on that. Spec was an interesting term. In the old days of Waterfall, everything was spec. We didn't physically move one engineering resource until we had 50-page books, market books, product books, function books, testing books. Until we had 4 or 5 of those books ready, nothing moved. Today, with agile and things moving faster, it's a little more difficult to have everything pre-written. So when we say spec, we really mean one of two things. We either specifically decided, and for example, you mentioned, if I have a version, or if I have a product that works on a certain OS and a new OS comes out, you have to, by definition, support that new OS when that OS comes out. You might say, well, I'll only do 75 or 80% of the function features that were supported in the previous OS, because otherwise I won't be able to make it. So I make a conscious decision of not doing something. The other side of tech debt is things we just did not consider. For example, we were building we have a new department. That department, in terms of recruiting, is running behind. So the people that are recruiting are not as high level as we wanted them to be, which means it's impacting quality, which means that the product that's kind of goes to the testing cycle end up being out, not as good as it could have been or should have been. And eventually, when that goes to the market and comes back as a problem, that also create tech debt that we didn't quote unquote anticipate. So there's both anticipated function features we decided not to do and leave to the next round or rounds, or things that we didn't do right, like cut corners in terms of testing or didn't do enough testing, or quality of the development exercise itself, that also creates a tech debt. What is most important to realize is that it is always a balance between perfect code and speed of delivery. Been there since day one of programming. It just changes a little bit based on the new programming styles we have, but the principles really hasn't changed, which really means it'll always be here. It will never disappear. If it'll never disappear, what we need to understand that in order to deal with it, what we need to do is we need to manage it. And in order to manage it, we need to be able to measure it. And if we can measure it and see where the trends are within the tech debt, is it something we knew? Is it something we did not? How fast it's moving? How fast are we eating into it versus not eating into it? All of these things need to be continuously measured, reviewed, measured, analyzed, reviewed, and then fed back into the cycle in terms of what do we need to do to change it to make it more efficient, because dealing with tech debt is one of the major impacts on the first one, which is R&D ROI.
So that's one of the things that we do. We do try and explain to companies that tech debt is a great indicator of both the quality of the software that you're developing and, by extension, your R&D organization. But the point is, If you had no tech debt, it kind of implies that your R&D organization is perfectionist, and either that means that you're producing very few products, or it means that you're taking a really long time to produce them so that everything is perfect. And so generally we see companies having somewhere, around 22% of the engineering resources dedicated to tech debt, because if it's higher, then it can speak to the quality of your organization, or it could just mean that you're going through a current period where you're focusing on some major thing. And then you have to look at it over time. But if you have, it's not like one of those things where you want to have 2% tech debt, because that can also imply that it's not that great. But so,
and let me say something maybe a little more blunt. You can tell I sometimes am. If you don't have tech debt, you are not developing software. If the question is, are you a good manager of your tech debt, or are you a bad manager of your tech debt?
Exactly. And
that's all there is.
From a business perspective, you just want to make sure that you're monitoring it. So if your R&D organization can't tell you what the tech debt expense is, then that's a bad thing. And that
would lead perfectly into, so how do you measure R&D progress?
Yeah, how do you measure R&D progress?
So, as you can guess, there's millions of things that we measure, but I think the most important ones, there's maybe 4 or 5 that are really the key ones. The first one is time to delivery. How long does it take from the time we identify a specific need by a customer? Remember, voice of the customer first. How long from the time we identified a need from the customer side to the time that we delivered an answer to that problem? So total time of delivery. And at the same time, the other side of that, of course, is what is the cost of delivery? How many people did we need to put on this in order to deliver it? And how much did it cost us? And I'm only talking at this point from R&D, which is product and engineering. I'm excluding the other pieces like marketing, sales, and customer success out of that. But in engineering perspective, what did it cost us to do that, both in time and in physical cost? Those two, by definition, created that imbalance between delivery. Salespeople want it tomorrow morning. Engineers want to have as much time as they can to build with it. QA people don't want to leave anything out the door until it's perfectly tested, which leads us to product quality. So you measure product quality. Those 3, time to deliver, cost of delivery, and product quality, relate very easily to the ones we just talked about before: quality, speed, and financial. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say, so just jumping ahead in terms of, out of all these metrics, which ones do you see as leading indicators? Because it's one thing to look at what you've done in the past and, the quality of things, but if you're a business person looking at all the metrics coming out of R&D and the engineering organization, what are the leading indicators of, the future or the ROI of the investment that you're making?
Great question. So there's 2 pieces. If you kind of take the first 3 that I talked about, time, cost, and quality, those are kind of high-level business that can be applied specifically to the R&D organization. But specifically to the R&D organization, there's really 2 that I look at. One of them is productivity. I look at things like velocity. How much value is created versus how much time does it take to create it? Mm-hmm. And automation. What % of the amount of work that people are doing is done manually versus done automatically? So the more automation that you have in the development, in the creation, in the testing, and in the deployment, the faster the machinery works through that, the more time that people in R&D have to physically work on creating code that creates solutions that go to market. So this is the first one, productivity. The second one would be technical debt. We continuously keep track of the time and the cost that it takes us to reduce technical debt. And what you see is, I'll give you an example. We were just at a company who was really investing heavily in new innovation. And what we found out that over a year, maybe 14 months, tech debt started growing because everybody wanted to work on the cool new stuff. Yeah. So basically engineering kind of naturally gravitated to the cool new development and left behind stuff that was not. So the age of things that are sitting in tech debt is important. as well as how fast is R&D churning into that. And you, again, there's no perfect answer. That is why CPOs and CTOs get paid. That's the art part of the work. Is you want to make sure that you're making sure that you're taking care of your technical debt enough to remove the things that are important out of it, while spending the rest of your time, like you said, about 75-25 approximately % new stuff versus tech debt, unless your tech debt seems to be growing. And if you can identify why is it growing faster than what it did before, you want to make sure that it is not something critical to the organization, because if it is, you probably want to take some time off. Make sure that you have a conversation with the business people. Make sure that people understand that you need to move a little backwards again in terms of time to delivery, and spend some more time into reducing the tech debt. And then as you do that and you go back to whatever the level that you've decided is approximately appropriate for the organization, once you do that, you go back to the original and move people back from tech debt to development. And that balance, those two are incredibly important. If you don't know that it's changing, and if you don't know how efficient you are, you can never make the decision on where your balance needs to be.
I get that. That is definitely, and that's part of why moving along to the next topic is so important, because, we hear from CFOs oftentimes that R&D is sort of a black box. And at the highest level, a SaaS company, for all the reasons that we all know about SaaS companies, everything is interconnected. And that means that R&D has to be aligned in terms of the business priorities, and that finance has to be able to understand and work with the R&D organization. And as you mentioned, there's an art to being a chief product officer or a chief technology officer. And that nuance and that art has to be aligned with, the finance organization, understanding that those choices that the head person is making. So what have you seen work really well? And give an example of something where you've seen it not work well at all.
So first, what is great for the finance side of the house now is two things. One, people that came, if you kind of think 20 years ago, CFOs were more about the mechanics of accounting than about technology. CFOs today are naturally embedded inside the technology. Yeah. So you don't have to explain to a CFO what technology is. You really want to explain why I need to do what I need to do in order to get that technology out the door. The other one is, of course, we have the ability to measure everything. So a couple of things in terms of making sure that the business works. First of all, and most important, and I keep saying that, always lead with the voice of the customer and make sure that everybody realizes who is bringing in which part of the voice of the customer. From the CFO and the financial people bringing in, this is the market, this is where our total spend can be, how can we measure the spend, not just for the total company, but within each group, based on where the most possible ROI is for each one of them. Those calculations sit on the finance side. And then as you kind of move further and further in towards development, from marketing and sales, and then product, and then eventually engineering, you slice those pieces more and more towards the technical side, but you always lead with the voice of the customer. To do this right, you want to really be, and that's one of the things that we saw, probably the strongest hurdle for that kind of activity to be successful is lack of well-defined cross-functional roles and responsibilities. You really want to make sure that everybody within the organization knows that they're all involved. So this is not finance says you have $27.2 million for next year, go figure out what you do with it, come back and tell us how you're using it. It's an iterative process. That process continuously interacts with other pieces of the company, but everybody knows what their function is and whether they make. We've even formalized that, things like RASI and RAPID. There's methodologies now that are well-defined to say, I decide, I'm consulted with, or I just get to know that this is happening. So everyone in the organization, from the engineering all the way up to product, marketing, sales, and finance have to have a well-defined role and responsibility in this process.
So role and responsibility, but then also what about, it's companies today have agile budgeting processes. So in order to maintain that, it can't be just once a year or once a quarter that you have this interaction.
You're running ahead of me. So before we get to that, yes, you want to define checkpoints and KPIs for each one of the stages for the product, the design, the development, the test, the deploy, and the manage, so you can tell as you go along. The same KPI structure needs to be applied to the quote unquote planning project process, all the way from strategic down to function features. So once you define those, the checkpoints, meaning at what point each one of the stages ends, what I expect to have in my hand when it's done, what reports should I be able to look at, and what is the most important thing for me to look at when that checkpoint happens, will generate a list of KPIs that you need to measure as you go to each one of those stages to be able to do that. And the answer is always the same: measure, report, assess, and refine. It's a cycle. And going back to the question you said about the cycles, old cycles used to be a year, annual management process. Everybody got together in November or December, and one of the companies I was in after the beginning of the year, and basically sat down and everybody argued, well, you had 27 million last year, how much you need today? I'll say 29, and then we'll all argue, and eventually we'll end up with a number for each one of the groups. And then you go back to your people and say, I got $29.2 million. Here's how it is. Let's make sure we spread it correctly amongst us. That is no longer works. Yes, it still works in terms of the global corporate strategy, but now you have to make sure that the process is iterative and it goes down as further down as you can. If you're building yourself in agile environment, and when I say agile, I don't just mean agile development, which is true too. I mean agile business processes. You should be able to go from an annual plan, strategic, to a quarterly plan, business units and reviews, down to cycles, all the way down potentially to a single release cycle or a sprint, where every time you go to one of those little cycles, you review, is it still the highest priority? Is it still making the right impact on my ROI? If it's not, what can I do to help? Do I need to move money from one side to the other? And that rolls to the quarterly, and that rolls to the annual. And if you do this thing long enough, kind of cycle within cycle within cycle within cycle, you actually end up with a much shorter next year business cycle, because you already are close to real-time view of what you are doing and need to be doing moving forward. And the annual cycle really only becomes more about the true strategy. We want to invest in M&A. We want to create a brand new product line. Not discussions on, so how many people you need in R&D next year in order to give me what I need to go. And then the last thing maybe, and maybe just as important, use tools. You'd be surprised at how many places I go work, companies that I work with, that are still doing everything on Word and spreadsheets. There are great tools out in the market, from simpler ones like Smartsheets to full suite end-to-end like Plan Views of the world, that do the planning across from a strategic, corporate, down to portfolio, all the way down to the Jira and line of code, if that's what you want to do.
Well, there's better products, even for engineering management and being able to pull the data out of Jira. I think of Jellyfish here in the Boston area. And, there's a few other options out there, but, they do a great job of pulling all the data together in an automated way.
And this is where the easy plugin is for the benchmarks. If you don't keep track of all of it and you don't benchmark them continuously, both between your groups, between your products, and even more importantly, between yourselves and your competitors and the people in the market, you don't really make strong, good decisions that eventually optimize your route to the best ROI.
So just in the interest of time, because we're approaching the top of the hour, and we do have some questions that we want to get to. Just talking about current trends, it's interesting talking to you and talking to Rakesh, who is going to be on the webinar with us, but had to bow out for a meeting that couldn't be changed with a major client of Bain's. It was interesting. The common theme was that the biggest current trend right now that Bain partners were hearing on R&D management was, how do we reduce costs or reduce costs in a way that increases productivity or the return? And you had some interesting thoughts about the difference, and let's just go through this super quickly. The difference between outsourcing and how that's evolved, and then just some of the best ways that people are managing to reduce costs in the current world.
Sure. So there's two parts to reducing cost. There's reducing the physical cost, how much an engineer costs me, which is usually where offshoring came about. We moved development or supplemented development with people that just cost us less. So it started with India and then moved to other parts of the world. And that was really more about, can I get approximately the same level of development, usually for the lesser complicated problems, cheaper than what I'm paying right now in wherever the center of the domain. Outsourcing is really a newer view of, I want to take a complete product or product line or function feature and the whole box, from owning it all the way down to developing it, maintain it, and taking it to the market and giving it to somebody. Again, it's sort of an offshore, but it's a slightly different view. And they will take responsibility for it and run with it. What it does, it increases both productivity and increases cost. I mean, decreases cost, improves cost, because usually those places are, again, cheaper from a personnel perspective. The other part, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry,
So,
my earphones beeped. I was
think
wondering if my battery
one of
died.
the interesting things is just, we were talking about before, you said that people are offshoring talent acquisition because that's been the focus for the past 10, 20 years in Silicon Valley and places like Boston, other tech centers, is how do I, attract the best engineers to build my company, whether it's with, incredible benefits and, incredible recruitment processes. But we do have
free food in a cafeteria, Google.
Yeah, but now you can hire people all over the world because COVID's led everybody to be remote. And you can also outsource by outsourcing a whole project, you're also putting the onus of getting the right skills and the talent and everything to produce that product. I'm just gonna, because we're running up against the end and I do want to get to a couple of the questions. I wanted to mention super quickly that we have a new.
Just Lauren, right before we go that, I just want to remind people you can reduce costs by reducing the engineering cost, and you can reduce costs by automating. So let's just remember that, right? Keep an eye on how can I automate function features, testing, whatever, in order to reduce the amount of time that engineers spend on doing something.
Exactly, and that's a great segue because that's one of the things that we're measuring in this new R&D benchmarking that we're introducing. So OPEXEngine's been, measuring SaaS and subscription KPIs, cost and overhead KPIs, sales, marketing, G&A, headcounts and expenses and productivity for a 360 view of the company for years and years and years. But now we're going more deeply into R&D and looking at organization and talent, and also just the ratios between QA and developers, QA and product managers, managers to developers, as well as looking at all the things that we talked about. So just a quick mention, because it's also because we're launching this now, we have a number of companies that are participating, and we only have until September 5th for companies to get their data in. So if anyone on the webinar is interested in participating, it's a great opportunity to get free access to benchmarking, to go more deeply into R&D, and then get a free report at the end of that. And then, we also are giving companies a 1-month subscription or access just to the R&D portion of our platform. So, and these are some of the metrics that we're tracking. So again, if, reach out to me or reach out to my colleague Utkarsh, who is managing the program. But with that, I'm just going to jump into a couple of these questions, because one of these, it's interesting. It'd be great to get your perspective, Rob, being on the other side, because I have my perspective on the business side. The question is, what role does FinOps play in analyzing and managing costs? Does it fall under R&D, or is it a joint effort cross-functionally? So, and even to questions like that, should Jellyfish, if you were using that as your engineering is that owned by R&D? Is it owned jointly with FinOps? Who manages it and pulls the data out?
So the answer, if you ever ask me from 3 years ago for the next future, the answer will always be joint. It used to be very separated. It can no longer be separate, because it's the transition of data and the transition of activities between them. And we talked about that, roles and responsibilities. It's not, FinOps has a role and engineering has a role, and they both live in their own little kingdoms. There's an overlap. And actually, no matter which department you take, there's always going to be some overlap. In terms of the ownership, I don't think it really matters as much as who owns it. In general, my observation is, the larger the company, the more likely there'll be a part of FinOps that will live in the engineering, quote unquote, role and responsibilities. But since the financial ops are responsible at the end for reporting it and managing it and measuring it, they should own it. They should just be aware that there's an overlap into the engineering, and find, like when I was at Progress, I had a FinOps person that reported to my organization, that was the interface between what we were doing and what FinOps were doing day to day. They would talk to me on a regular basis and do the kind of the translation back and forth, and make sure that the transfer of data both up and down the stream were done efficiently.
Excellent. Do you think it's possible to benchmark product to engineer ratios for ideal output? I mean, I think that would definitely
So
vary.
the answer is, you can always measure everything. There's no such thing as ideal. Ideal is what, between the corporate
Optimal
strategy and the execution strategy, what do you believe is creating the highest ROI? And if the more you measure, the more you benchmark, the closer you get to real-time view of that. As you optimize that ROI, that whatever that number ends up being is the right number. It's not a reverse. And yes, you can measure it though.
But I mean, it's also, if you're building a really complex, big enterprise product, you're going to have more developers on it than if you're building a small tool or something that you could do with, 1 or 2 folks.
Which is why I don't really measure ratio as much as when we talked about the delivery, the cost per unit.
Mm-hmm.
What does it cost me? And that cost per unit takes into account the speed, the quality of the people, are the onshore or offshore cost, are they well-trained or less well-trained? All these things end up being components of one number, which is that development unit. That development unit is probably the most accurate view of your life, not the actual number as much as the changes in that number as time goes by.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of more questions on tech debt. If we didn't get to that, we will. I mean, we spoke a lot about tech debt, but this has been awesome. Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate your input, and I love this conversation with you.
I can talk about tech debt until tomorrow morning.